Now I'll switch gears to recording. So we're starting the recording session, and I want to warmly welcome Reverend Professor Dr. Jim Lawrence, who wears a lot of different hats and is many different degrees, into our Zoom room. And many of you know Professor Lawrence in other capacities and contexts. For those of you who don't, let me just very briefly introduce him. Currently president of—
Yeah, the class is on right now. You want to listen? I'm sleeping, so.
And also, it's just a quick housekeeping reminder. If those of you who are chiming in could keep your microphones muted, that would be fantastic. Until and I forget, as the host, I have the all-powerful God arm of muting people at will. I always need to remember this. Prior to becoming president of the Swedenborgian Church of North America, which is one of the strands of American Swedenborgianism out there, Jim Lawrence was the dean of the Center for Swedenborgian Studies here in Berkeley, California, and part of the team that welcomed that theological school from the East Coast when it moved out west. He holds not one, but two doctorates, one in ministry, one in theology, from the Graduate Theological Union, and has published extensively on Swedenborg and been one of the most learned scholars in the Swedenborgian orbit, to my mind, who's paid attention to Swedenborg in the history of hermeneutical interpretation. How does Swedenborg's particular exegesis of biblical text fit into bigger pictures of how Christians have tried to interpret and struggle with biblical text? And I think the biggest struggle is the apocalypse, the book of Revelation. So we're really fortunate that Jim has written the new critical introduction for the New Century edition of Swedenborg's big book on the apocalypse, and that he's here with us to talk about his work today. So I will turn the table over to you, Jim. And if you want, I can enable screen sharing.
Do that.
Okay. Okay, so screen sharing is enabled.
Hey, well, it's wonderful to be here, folks. I know nearly everybody. So let me kind of get it in slideshow mode. I want people, I could easily, talk the whole class time. That's just part of my Irishness. I'm going to stop every 2 or 3 slides and just have discussion. It's a fairly knowledgeable group we have here. I can see just, the vast majority are been longtime sleuthers in the Swedenborgiana world. And so it's not an unfamiliar topic. And the essay I wrote brings up some interesting kind of controversies. I want to be able to get to those. But the book of Revelation, it ends up, Swedenborg jumps to the end of the Bible after going through his intention to do the entire Bible verse by verse. After he was getting about 3/4 of the way through Exodus, he realized he would never make it, and he gallops in a hurry to the end of Exodus and begins putting together his 5 books that came after that right away, 4 of which were all derivative of the Arcana, and then his big one, his new one, Heaven and Hell, which becomes his all-time bestseller, issued the year after he finished the Arcana. And then what's unbeknownst to the worldly scene is that he had already jumped to the end of the Bible and to work on the book of Revelation, and begins to use it as a retrospective, so that he will end up doing the whole Bible. And so that's how he gets to the apocalypse. And the most famous portrait done of Swedenborg of the 20 or so that we know of is pictured here by Percroft Elder in 1766, the year he comes out. He's holding Apocalypsis Revelata in his hands there. It's the last book that he will publish anonymously. His name is not on the title page of this one. The next book, which is Conjugal Love, he will finally sign. So let's talk about vocabulary a little bit. A lot of people in our culture think apocalypse means a wild war or something. It's the explosions, it's the chaos, but that's not the meaning of apocalypse. The Greek word apocalypsis simply means a revealing. It simply means to reveal something. And a lot of people link it with Armageddon. A lot of people in our culture think apocalypse and Armageddon are like synonyms that are interchangeable, but that's not true. Armageddon is a scene of a great battle in the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation, you can see in the English title of it, does refer to the Greek word of apocalypsis to mean reveal. So it's the book of revealing, book of Revelation. But what's interesting and ironic is that what Swedenborg does reveal in the apocalypse is spectacularly wild, something that Pat Robertson couldn't even come up with. All of the rapture into the world kinds of scenarios that the fantasy literature around the apocalypse in the contemporary century is tame compared to what is actually going on, what Swedenborg is actually revealing as something that unfolded. The book itself has had a wild ride. The book of Revelation barely made it into the canon. It was not on a lot of lists. The Christian canon does not get set until late in the 4th century. So think about that. The Pauline epistles are written in the late 1st century. And then there were all these other epistles, and now we know all about the Gnostic Gospels. And we know that the Gospels were written also 1st century. Even the latest one, the Gospel of John, the latest date would be 1st decade of the 2nd century. Most scholars put it at about 90 of the Common Era. So there are all these texts proliferating around the Mediterranean basin because, the Christians split with the Jewish folks in the diaspora of 70, and when they're being sacked, when it's being taken over, punished in the Roman Empire, and the diaspora begins. Everybody disperses all over the Mediterranean, and so all these texts are proliferating, and many regions have their own texts. The book of Revelation is not rising to the top of the list in many of those spaces. But something interesting happens in the 4th century, and I think it plays well into Swedenborgian thought with the BOR. That's the that's the shorthand that they use in the business. So I will say the BOR a lot here for the book of Revelation or the apocalypse. Is that there was a big fight in the 4th century. Many people know about Constantine. Many people know about the Council of Nicaea. They know that the Emperor of Rome, in an amazing plot change of what's going on with this fledgling dramatic faith in the Roman Empire, which was about 5% of the adherents in religion at that time were, with the little Christian movement, but it was a very sexy 5%. I won't quite compare it to Scientology, but a lot of people knew about Christians because of their dramatic lifestyles, and they were persecuted heavily when there were persecutions. It was not always persecutorial, but there were some major persecutions, and we know about Christians in the Colosseum having to fight with lions and so forth. And what changed all of that is that the Emperor of Rome converted to Christianity. Wow, that does a lot for a small faith membership rolls. So Constantine converts to Christianity around 324, and suddenly, 90% of the realm can't wait to join, because that's the new power. That's the new power club. But Constantine was appalled at the arguments around the nature of Jesus that he saw happening, the famous Arian controversy. And so the Christians, one of the controversies of Christians being attacked in theological arguments, in polemical arguments with Jewish philosophers and with Greek philosophers, is that they appeared to be either ditheistic or tritheistic, that they had either 2 or 3 gods. And it's like, what is it? And a lot of Christians, especially as they became more rising up in the educated classes, it began primarily as a working class movement, but as it gained more and more philosophers and folks who were sort of in the front rank of cultural discourse, they wrestled with these questions. What are we saying? What are we saying is the deal with Jesus Christ? And so Arius, who came out of Egypt, Alexandria, extremely popular, maybe the Joel Osteen of his times, was a powerful, popular theologian, and he developed a narrative that demoted Jesus a little bit, and he had a very logical sort of way to explain why Jesus is not exactly God, because the Father is underived. The Father's underived, but the Son is derived from the Father. Therefore, they can't be the same. And that was a nice escape hatch for a lot of the intelligentsia in Christianity. But the traditionalists were furious about that. And Athanasius being when Athanasius being the leader of the traditionalists, a very famous person, and people who know their Swedenborgiana know that Swedenborg critiques all of the great creeds that come out of the great councils of the church. But he says, if there's one that you might want to follow a little bit, it's the Athanasian Creed. That's a whole other story about Athanasius. Athanasius was a big cheese, but he won at Nicaea. So the Nicene Creed has a high parallelism, a high divinity place for Jesus in its creed. But what happens? So he wins. So Athanasius wins at the Council of Nicaea, but then some of the successor emperors became Arian. So the argument wasn't over, and Athanasius became popular again, or Athanasius was actually banished to the desert. It had to go in exile. The point of this slide is that Athanasius loved the book of Revelation because it had a high Christology. It functioned like a fifth gospel, and so the gospels were clearly going to be canonical. There still was not an official canon, but we're getting really close to it in Athanasius's old age. And his list of the proper books is the very last list that's extant in 4th century manuscripts. That is the list that does get canonized, right? So Athanasius had a lot of sway, and it's just interesting to think about the logic of the book of Revelation, which is so hard to understand. Nevertheless, you just follow it like a fantasy movie and just watch Hollywood Disney productions or Pixar just have the stories, and it's a tremendous presentation of the human divine God that is ruling the universe. So that's what makes it into historical Christianity, that the book sneaks into the canon. If you read my essay, you'll see that it continues to be a controversial book, that it was not heavily read in many centuries. When we get to the Reformation, Luther didn't like it at all, called it a damnable book. It was most of the first generation reformers had little use for it. Calvin had very little use for it. It started to catch on later on. But in the Eastern Church, it's the only book in the entire canon of Scripture, Judeo-Christian canon, the only book of the canon that's never read in the divine liturgy throughout the calendar year. So, it's kind of a controversial place, but we living now in the 21st century, and maybe all of us actually knew the 20th century, have lived through some new fascination with this book in the contemporary times. All right, I'm going to pause for a second. Now we're going to start talking about Swedenborg's engagement with what we can think of as one of Swedenborg's 7 major works. Anybody want to ask a question, make a comment, argue about anything? Yep, everybody okay? Unmute yourself and say, I want to talk. All right, so let's remember, if we need to remember, maybe not everybody would put this in their memory bank, but every denomination of the Swedenborgian faith on the planet uses the phrase New Jerusalem in their incorporated title. So it's clearly had a significant place in the original formation vision of how the entire faith was being understood. It was making a statement about the New Age. And the New Age, we'll look at that in a second, about the theology of history, not a history of theology, a theology of history, and the way that book functions in that discourse. So I enjoyed working on this project. It took years. We tried to get Harold Hodgson, who's a professor at Oxford. Devin, I might even know him personally, whose grandfather was Clarence Hodgson, who was a major Swedenborgian thinker, early 20th century, who wrote a PhD dissertation on Swedenborg. And Howard Hodgson is not confessionally a Swedenborgian, but he has a lot of affection for the tradition. He's been at Bernatha many times. And like I say, he's an Oxford professor of history. He specializes in the 17th century, but also can cover the 18th century. And he was willing to do it, but he kept putting it off. And then he finally said, I can't get to it for 2 years. So I stepped in, being trained as a historian and a lover of Swedenborg, offered to do it. So I was kind of a last resort. And I just want to say that I decided to do a couple of years of research before I began writing it. I developed a graduate level school course that I taught a couple of times here at the Graduate Theological Union called Apocalypse Above, and it barely mentioned Swedenborg. I wanted to understand how this last closing wild book of the Judeo-Christian canon had lived in the discourse history of Christianity. So I wanted to know its interpretation history. And I wanted to know to what extent Swedenborg might have been aware of some of the prior discourse. So I spent a lot of time getting up to speed on the study of the BOR. And it's a wonderful world of scholarship. There's, a lot of biblical scholars, New Testament especially, who will even, there was like 10 years of a major group of scholars at the American Academy of Religion who had a thing on the BOR for a long time. And so they produce a lot of books and essays, tremendous resources for understanding contemporary ways to understand this book. So that I spent a lot of time getting ready for it. Now, so Swedenborg tells a story And we will be getting, almost everybody in this who has shown up here knows that he wrote a first work called Apocalypse Explained. I talk about that in the essay, and I'll talk about it today, that I believe I spent a lot of time trying to answer the question that's never been answered. Why did he not publish it? We'll get to that. And so this is the second book, and the two books have the two attempts to come at the meaning of these very skinny little number of biblical pages, that are these 22 chapters of the book of Revelation, have a lot of differences between them, which is a little hard for some people to understand why, if he's got this direct pipeline to, the truth, and he's got, angels, Jesus occasionally strolling by, and he's getting all the straight dope, why would he have so much work put in and then not publish it and then publish something else that's different? And I mentioned, and he does speak about it in Conjugal Love, the book that he signs when he tells a spiritual story. Conjugal Love of being told by the Lord, remember that work that you started on the book of Revelation. You are to return to that work and bring it to conclusion within 2 years. Well, since he's publishing that book in 1768, and he's already published Apocalypsis Revelata, we got to figure his math is good, so we can understand when he went back to it. And so the book that he does publish, here's what the interset. I want to say a little bit about his winding road to the Revelation Unveiled. That's the slide I have on the screen here. So some of what I said relates especially to the lower part of this slide. I love this little book that was ultimately published with a really good article about it by Wilson Van Dusen. The first thing that is posthumously off his pen, after he has his famous second Christophany experience, where he believes, in his own words, as he writes in his journals and as he tells people later in life, that he had these experiences. He had two famous experiences, one spring and another spring later, where he had a face-to-face with the Lord in his own telling of it, and that he was to shift his life work to a new kind of adventure, which is to bring forth the inner sense of Scripture. And it's interesting that the oldest thing we have, and he was in the middle of Worship and Love of God, two parts of which he had already published, and he just drops it completely. The next thing that he scribbles out is just a kind of a notebook that was found in his papers after his death, that Messiah Venturo, the Latin for the Messiah about to come. So what is he saying here? So the very first reflection he's wrestling with is he feels that he has been given an impression, apparently, that the Messiah is about to come. The second coming is about to happen. And in this little booklet, he's picking out Bible passages that might have an inner sense talking about that. And if anybody goes and looks at this, you go, well, that's interesting. These aren't the passages of the Bible. It's a very unusual selection of biblical passages. And Van Dusen's got an interesting kind of reflection on it, basically saying he's in his inner life, and it's his first wrestling and grappling with what he feels he's been called to engage. So right off the bat, he's reaching for the Messiah about to come. Then he says, okay, maybe he agrees with us today, looking back at that 1745 several pages of biblical passages, and go, I think you need to be a little more systematic here. He jumps into a massive set of notebooks where he begins to work not verse by verse, but very heavily, very extensively on biblical passages around. It's called, the way he just titled it, Adversaria. It was not published by him. It wasn't published for a century after he died. But we see this massive notebook. It comes out in 8 volumes, people, where he was working meticulously with the Bible to discern its inner meaning. And adversaria in the Latin it means various things. Various things. He's still kind of hunting around for various things, but he's proving to be the usual self we know him to be in his biography, being very systematic and extensive. So that's the next thing he does. Then he feels ready to jump into Secrets of Heaven. And so he begins Genesis 1:1, and we all know about that, called the Arcana for a long time. And then we already spoke about the move to the derivative works. Now, of those derivative works, set aside heaven and hell, although that talks a lot about the other world. And we set aside other planets, which Devin has mentioned. The others are talking really about the book of Revelation. The other 3 were the Last Judgment, the White Horse, and I can't remember the third one off the top of my head. But he's working heavily on the closing book of the Bible and the meaning of it, even though he's using in the 1758 derivative works primarily information. He's expanding on commentary he started in the Arcana, right? So, but and then he begins writing Revelata Explicata, or Apocalypse Explained, and the NCE folks at the foundation really don't want us to say Apocalypse Explained anymore. They want this consistent language around it, even though there's never been anything published called Revelation Explained. But that's okay. Jonathan and Stuart, they want me to do that, I'll do it. So Revelation Explained is Apocalypse Explicata. It's often believed that it was not begun until the late 50s. I argue against that in this essay, but he's clearly working the book of Revelation. Then we can jump into 1763. So this is probably coming into the time he talks about it in Conjugal Love. The Lord says, go back to that work that you set aside. Well, we can see that he's engaging the Last Judgment again, because in the 1758 short work called The Last Judgment, he tells the story of observing the Last Judgment take place basically across the year 1757. And many of us know all about that. As the last piece of the winding road to Revelation Unveiled, there's his famous 6 volumes of his spiritual journal, Experientiae Spiritualis. This is often called the spiritual diary. So there you look at the years there, it's all the way back to 1747, when he still worked, before he starts the Arcana, 2 years before he starts the Arcana. And he continues it long into the writings, all the way up to the threshold of writing Revelation Unveiled. And I'm in the camp that agrees that with Revelation Unveiled, he begins it when I talk about the hybrid genre of Revelation Unveiled, that the second piece is spiritualist literature. He starts giving his stories of that would be the kind of thing that he would have put in the spiritual diary, that he's bringing it into his published work. And that could be one reason why he quit keeping the journal at that point. So here's his winding road to the second attempt to interpret verse by verse what the heck this wild symbolic book is actually about in its inner sense. I'm going to go on to then what it does say. Here's so here's the story of the book of Revelation in its inner sense. Beloved, the last judgment has happened. It's a done deed. It's a judgment, and only God can judge. Only God can make these determinations and judgments. And here are the judgments that happened in the last judgment. My beloved family, friends, colleagues who are Protestants, you had some errors in your work. There are judgments against Protestant errors, and actually they're ferocious judgments against errors. Now let me turn to my Catholic friends. We have some problems there too. And there's judgments against the Roman Catholic religious system. As I mentioned in my essay someplace, because I'm assuming few people read that much of it, he never mentions Eastern Orthodoxy until the last couple of years of his writings. And then he has three references to what he calls it the Greek church, but he means Eastern Orthodoxy. And he has two references in the 1769 book that's kind of a prelude to true Christianity.
Are you able to pull up Zoom on your phone? Because I can't on my phone. Oops. Apology, I turned it off.
Rosanna, is that a question for me? I didn't catch that. Devin, did you catch that?
I think it was an inadvertent unmuting.
Okay.
So I've muted her
Okay.
again. And I'll just say here to everybody, if you want to leave questions or comments for Jim, you can put it in the chat and I'll keep tabs on that. Or even if you just want to put your name in the queue, when we have a pause or at the end of the slideshow, I'll be sure to go back to that.
Yeah, I think I'll finish this slide and pick up the one before it, and then I'll pause again. So be thinking of those questions, scratching your head really hard. How can I show that I'm interested? One of my favorite memories, by the way, when I was a little kid in Sunday school, it's interesting to, reflect back as one gets older, one does that a lot more. And I realized, that I had this strong memory of running around. All the kids hated Sunday school. I'm like, it's like first grade, second grade. And I remember running around with my friends trying to get them to think of questions to ask, because these Sunday school teachers, they're just our parents, they don't really know what to do. They're just trying, and so we should try to, I'm kind of rallying the troops to ask these questions. That's kind of a fond memory I have. I dislike Sunday school with all of the rest of it too. Anyway, so in the Eastern, the Greek Church, the Eastern Orthodoxy, he has three references, and basically he says the problems with Eastern Orthodoxy are the same as the Roman Catholic Church. They got the same issues, which is not exactly a careful conversation, and so, but I'll leave it at that. So that you see third and fourth points here, that the book of Revelation, the first three, there's 22 chapters in the book of Revelation. The first three are the 7 letters to the 7 churches from the 7 angels. And then you've got chapters 4 and 5, which is the throne room in heaven. And you see Jesus on the throne, and he holds a locked book and so forth. And so the last judgment has happened. And these judgments, only God can judge. Jesus is on the throne, and he's been in charge of sorting things out. And so, first of all, we've got some judgments against the Protestants, or what he would call the Reformed churches. And so that's the 7 seals breaking and the 7 trumpets sounding. And that's 5 chapters. And then we move into the Roman Catholic system. We got some problems there too. 7 vials pouring, the woman and the son, Babylon destroyed. That takes us all the way to chapter 18. The last 4 chapters is a new church now arises. All right. So this is why the book of Revelation is the senior branding book for all of the organized religions. And if you go to the cathedral in Bernathen, the chancel is set up with a book of Revelation, seeing the lampstands in a circle around the open word. And so one of the most famous cathedrals in the country, if not the world, has a chancel with a scene with the throne room of the book of Revelation being the space of worship. All right. So to go back to the other slide that I jumped over, it's a complicated book, Revelation Unveiled. It's not a simple verse, but even with the Arcana, it's not a simple verse by verse biblical commentary because of the famous interchapter articles. They end up totaling 90 of them by the time you get through all of the volumes of Secrets of Heaven. So he was doing theology very early in the Arcana. All this stuff is happening verse by verse. This means that, this means that. Here's the spiritual piece of that. Here's what's happening dynamically in these verses. And he's starting to become a systematic theologian, a topical theologian, and he's shaping what's called the interchapter articles, which he's formulating his theology. Same thing going on in Revelation Unveiled, but there's even more going on because now he has so it's clearly biblical commentary. That's the front burner stuff. It's just, you go verse by verse, every book of all 22 chapters. Then you get the theology and the spiritualist literature in some of the explanations and some of the codas between chapters. So that if you wanted to study, Swedenborg is more famous in historical studies for the middle genre than he is for the first or third. One of my little hobbies here, here in Berkeley, a block from where Devin and I are sitting, there's the 4th largest theological library in the country. You can go over to the GTU library and go say down all the biblical commentary, aisle after aisle of the biblical stuff. You can just take your finger, book after book after book, history of biblical interpretation, and see how often Swedenborg shows up in the index, that he's treated it all. And I would say absolutely hardly ever. Occasionally you'll see something, I've made a list of things, but the world did not pay attention. The religious world did not pay attention to his biblical commentary. And the traditions that teach biblical commentary are those who kind of believe it. So you believe in it, and so they're writing for their perspective. Swedenborg's not in the game. Theology, I would say Swedenborg is rarely treated in works of historical theology. He's treated by cultural historians who are not devotional historians, theologians. But spiritualist literature, Swedenborg is famous for that. And in the 19th century, he reached his highest fame around 1880, primarily because of the rise of spiritualism. And Swedenborg was still today, and he was very much at that time, regarded as the first modern kind of writer speaking in a realistic way of engaging a world that's really there and that you can touch, and there are ways to get to it, which of course Swedenborgians aren't that into the seances and whatnot. But so it's interesting, of the 3 genres, the one that Swedenborgians would take the least pay the least attention to is the one that's the most common in the world. All right, let me pause for a second before we proceed and see now if somebody's chomping to get in here.
I need to be muted.
No?
Anyone want to chime in?
Oh.
Or we can continue. Maybe the thoughts are percolating. It's not
Okay.
possible to see everybody here, so.
I have a question. I just didn't get my hand up.
Oh, great. I think that's
Barbara
Barbara,
Piper.
right? Yeah,
Yeah,
Barbara, go
thank
for it.
Yes, Jim, just on your last comment, remarking that, you know, the sensational part of the interpretations, and it comes under the spiritualist banner, and yet the theological world, the organized religion world didn't pay attention to it. Is this perhaps one of the reasons that sometimes we encounter people who are ministers, preachers, whatever, who preach of the afterlife but don't believe it?
Yeah. Well, I remember you very well, Barbara,
Thank
from
you.
the time I did a talk on near-death
Yes,
studies. And I remember I was like, all right, I know that name now. I don't leave the chat.
I'm
Barbara,
near death.
share with us, right? Because that's a big topic for me. And I do a lot of ongoing scholarship. I plan to do a
Yeah.
lot more with it in the denomination, front burner it. I believe well, it's just so amazing. I wrote something that's, I think, going to come out in the next, messengers, the president's message. We had I went to a memorial service for a student who was murdered here just a few weeks ago. And it was interesting to see, and actually I've been now to 2 memorial services for this student. And I've heard a total of maybe 15 speakers, and only 2 out of the 15 gave any sense that there's a bigger picture. Right. And so you get that all the time with a lot of contemporary memorial services in the more educated parts of the planet, the intelligentsia, that don't go there. And it's interesting that in my near-death studies work, I like to talk about Swedenborg himself experienced that. It was a big pivot point for him in 1734. He's in Leipzig, Germany, publishing his Principia. And I don't know what it is about those Germans, Devin, but he was really amazed at the level of unbelief that he encountered among the intelligentsia. And you can see in his biography, that's a pivot point for him in his science work, because what he says, and we see it in his journals, what he says is, it's too bad because they don't see the evidence for it. So we need to see the evidence. They're not going to take it on simple faith. And therefore, let's work on that. Let's work on that. And let's find, because we need to, if we can prove that there's an immortal soul that is fused in the body, that is released at physical death, that'll answer the God question pretty well too. And so he begins working scientifically for the rest of the 30s on anatomy, trying to find the soul in the body. He makes some amazing, it's one of the places Swedenborg has a place in science history in several different ways. And one of them is anatomical research. He's the only reason he's spending so many years on that is he's looking to answer that unbelief that he experiences. And it leads to his eruption in his own spiritual life. That is, if you want to kind of do a postmodern critique of Swedenborg and sort of psychologize him a little bit. So the guy was getting a little overwrought about this stuff. And sure enough, his psyche, broke open something for him. And he thought he had these experiences, or he went through some kind of transformation. And then he really did find the soul in a certain way, is how the story goes. And that leads to his writing as a spiritualist author, because from the get-go in the Arcana, he tells the reader in the first few pages that it's been permitted to me to have these extraordinary experiences, and I'm bringing helpful information from, as the famous line for Swedenborg, right? From things heard and seen. We're talking We're talking what we go for evidence. We're talking about real data here. But of course, it's subjective human data. It falls under the scope of the soft sciences of sociology and psychology. But so does near-death studies. And we find that lots of scientists have a problem studying near-death studies because they just assume it's hooey. And yet a lot of people who aren't even necessarily buying into it are, how are you being scientific about that? In sociology and psychology, human testimonies is data to study. And when it quantifies to the level that it's quantifying, there's a problem. I think there's a problem with people who refuse to even talk about it. You know, what scares you about this topic? So I see Holly's hand up.
Thank you.
Hi, well, I was gonna, just looking at this slide that you have up, I'm having a time travel issue that there could have been so many Protestant errors and Roman Catholic errors at the time that the Revelation was written. I mean, it seemed to me like, you know, those things would be more in Swedenborg's time, but that Revelation had been written, you know, like in the 1st or 2nd century, right? And was there time for all those errors by the time that Revelation had been written?
Well, I think you're tiptoeing into what I think is it's easy to critique his reading of the book of Revelation as a little odd at this point in our history, because essentially he's saying that, gee, the book of Revelation could not be, that you need a key to unlock its meaning. And the key has never existed because the time was not at hand. But now the time is at hand and I have been given the key and I can unlock it. So what that says is that, gee, you're saying that God put a book in the Bible for 1700 years that nobody could know what the heck it was about for 1700 years? I think there's a challenge making that argument in the larger culture. And then even beyond that, one reason in the opening few paragraphs of the essay, I talk about that it's the least read of his 7 major works. And I think the reason is that now it seems a little strange to be speaking about doctrinal arguments of the 18th century. And it's not kind of live spiritual information for a lot of people today. So, Lynn?
Thanks, Jim. I'm loving this. Can you see me? You can't see me yet. Okay, here we go. Here we are. Hi, everyone. I really love, I've been reading your work here, and I think some of the things that I'm looking at when in here, the value driven of the 3 Abrahamic religions. When you look at exegetical practices and understand scripture, that canonical allegoresis. I believe that the terminology of correspondences, I do think this page 7 has a lot to do with how we understand and critique that biblical text. And I'd love you to go further a little bit on that in the correspondence, because I think when I look at what you've written and what you're sharing, that internal knowledge, that internal sense, we're working all the way back to Jesus and the modernity now. We're looking at even a further distance from nature in itself. If you look at some of the transcendentalists and the work that we've been doing with Devin and some of the other works, but I feel like this idea of that internal sense of connection, that internal sense of the word that you bring up so well in your design, how close to correspondence are we, in the spiritual worlds, and how close do we need to get into a depth to be able to understand? So I have that question on correspondences for sure. I think that's probably enough for for now, but I definitely am. I just think when you look at that connection, I think we're looking at the Arian controversy, Constantine controversy, but today we have, technology, and it's like, it's almost that relationship to me now. Kids so embedded in technology, there's no presence. There's no presence in the consciousness. And what was it like back then with Protestant and Catholic, reforms, and the Nicene Creed has been very deeply recognized. So I think, coming back full circle, we're at a crisis time still, but, I guess I want that feedback of correspondence and what you see to go forward.
Well, we do, and I'll let Devin speak, but we have worked a lot on pluralism in the Swedenborgian tradition. And it was a Swedenborgian who shaped the first Parliament of the World's Religions. And Charles Carroll Bonney, an attorney in the Chicago church, who was on the short list for the Supreme Court many times, and a very well-known attorney in the late 19th century, especially caring about immigration rights. Those days, it was Catholics, and I mean, it was Italians and Irish, but there was a lot of abuse of immigrants, and he was sort of a specialist. And he shapes a pluralist reading in Swedenborg, and it's easy to do in Swedenborg. I mean, one reason why Revelation Unveiled is not heavily engaged in the same way Apocalypse Explicata, the 6 volumes that were only published posthumously, is that, it gets too specific in he's really nailing the problems of historical religion, and it's why the new church has to replace the old church, right? So so now that's like we jump ahead a quarter of a millennium later, and it doesn't have the same sort of feeling for us. But there are other parts of Swedenborg that are very, he has pluralists. He's upset that a couple of major ideas are not being dealt with properly, but he still respects the capacity of people everywhere to be, connecting with God through their good intentions, the attempts to live a good life. So in that sense, Swedenborg is both a pluralist and also a critic of certain historical moments. Yeah. Devin?
I wanted to lift up a question that came in the chat and provide a quick answer and see if you wanted to gloss further on it, Jim. We had a question about channeling. If you scroll down to it here, has anyone claimed to channel or communicate with Swedenborg himself?
Oh, yes.
And the immediate answer is yes. And I think Jim is right on with other scholars who have seen the unique feature of Swedenborg's work in Apocalypse Revealed, this interchapter material, the memorabilia that foreground visionary experience, inaugurates a new genre, a new spiritualist way of writing with concrete specificity about paranormal experience. And 2 figures come to mind to briefly mention. I do a lot of stuff in the American 19th century where these figures are important. Thomas Lake Harris and Andrew Jackson Davis. They're leading spiritualists in an Anglo-British American context. And especially with Andrew Jackson Davis, the so-called seer from Poughkeepsie, New York, the shoemaker from New York, who, thanks to his spiritual communication, could converse in 10 different languages and read Hebrew, even though he was an uneducated, more or less illiterate cobbler. In his spiritual autobiography, published in 1857, The Magic Staff, he narrates how Swedenborg himself comes down to a mountain in upstate New York and gives him a grand commission. So Swedenborg becomes almost like a trope in the spiritualist literature itself, who authenticates the validity of your journey, of your own claim to revelation. He kind of gives it a seal of approval.
Yeah, great. And I'm looking at, I just also want to, Linda's comment in chat, I also want to say there's a tremendous amount of research being done. The best place is what's it called? Near-deathstudies.org, near-death.org. I could send it to the link to anybody, but look for Jeffrey Long. He's one of the major researchers. There's dozens of them now. And that the place where it's being accumulated quantitatively in a very fastidious kind of sociological, methodological way. They're just trying to capture testimonies. Of course, a lot of testimonies, they have like 4 tiers of them, trustworthy, whatnot, and they're studying them. So there's a lot going on, and you'll see a lot of diversity to a certain extent, and you'll also see some interesting similarity. The big similarity being that that this is not all there is. So there's that, and there have been people who have believed to channel Swedenborg. We had a very significant person in convention named Peter Fransuch. He was a psychiatrist, Dr. Peter Fransuch in Los Angeles, and he started groups that got really big. And so he's passed away now. And then there's this book. It's kind of thick. It's called The New Revelation of the Lord Jesus Christ. And it's by a woman who claims to have, it's published out of Santa Barbara. And she claims to have had, there's 30 chapters of constant conversations with Swedenborg now in the spiritual world. So anyway, Swedenborg was not only big with the 19th century, as Devin was saying, Thomas Lake Harris and Andrew Jackson Davis both being deeply versed in Swedenborg, and avowedly so. But also then we get at the end of that century, into the 20th century, more academic studies, like at Duke University, the study for psychic research. And we get 30 or 40 years of university level. And you have William James at Harvard doing studies, especially with Edwin Starbuck, who's the real researcher behind his famous book, Varieties of Religious Experience. And William James, who of course almost everybody, if not everybody knows, grew up in a Swedenborgian household, was his first science field in Harvard was biology. And he was very interested in what can be understood about the inner dimensions of experience. And so he ends up having the first chair of psychology at Harvard University. So all of that, Swedenborg is in the mix, because with the advent of Freud, and at the same time you say Jung and William James, we move into the modern field of clinical psychology that moves into the depthful spaces of the inner life and these subconscious levels of the mind where all the real action is. So Swedenborg is active there. Jung does a lot of reading of Swedenborg, and he has a really complex take on Swedenborg. So it's fun to do these cultural studies of the amazing diverse ways in which Swedenborg, who was, if the word polymath can apply to somebody, I think it can apply to Swedenborg, and is that his thought world touches, just touches a dozen fields in significant ways. Okay. All right, let's see where we're at. So in the interpretation history, one thing to note about interpretation work in traditions, and we've already mentioned, didn't I mention the lost gospels, the Gnostic gospels, which are the lost gospels. When you study interpretation history in the 21st century, you're studying the viewpoints that made it into history. Devin, I'm going to see your hand again. You want to say something? Oh, you can take it down. So, and in all the major faith traditions, another class that I taught and worked on for quite a while it was comparative mysticism, looking at, especially using Stephen Katz at Boston University, is a really fat book where he covers 8 traditions. You can look at the mysticism classic texts, the ones that are honored as kind of canonical for mysticism, how mysticism is understood and experienced in all the major faith traditions. Well, you can see in every single instance from the vantage point of the 20th and 21st century that they fall in line with one another within the traditions. That's one reason. So you see a lot of if there was a lot of diversity of viewpoint, we often don't know it because they were smashed out of existence by the victors. So that's what happens with the Nag Hammadi text with Elaine Pagels, or some of us in Swedenborgian studies are very interested in the history of Western esotericism, where there was an unbeknownst library that had been buried forever in the 14th century called the Corpus Hermeticum, and these texts, 17 texts that hadn't been seen for a long time. So sometimes you can find these things and go, oh, like in the case of the Corpus Hermeticum, Swedenborg's very alive as a topic in Western esoteric studies and history, that there's all this discourse happening in the 2nd and 3rd centuries that we didn't know about before, right? And so we did. So anyway, here what I'm showing here are these frameworks. These are the ones that are clear winners in history. And so the first one is preterist, and that comes from a Jewish word, ultimately, that means basically the past that's already occurred. And so there were a lot of people, most contemporary, secular, or non-confessional, they're not into the book of Revelation as like their Bible. A lot of scholars, the dominant viewpoint of the BOR for all those great scholars at the Academy of Religions, believe that the symbolism is all about 1st and 2nd century Roman Empire stuff. It's all about the cultural forces of oppression. It's all about the attempt of whoever this Christian prophet John was. Most people do not believe we're talking about the Apostle John. That he was trying to tell a story in code to be safe politically, that people in the know would understand as the dynamics of the faith trying to survive with the persecutions and the social oppression going on against Christians before the 4th century, when it all changes. So the book of Revelation was written probably around 120 or so. So we're talking really early. So a lot of people then the early commentators believe that and still today you'll get a standard position in the Catholic Church, especially, that the book of Revelation, it talked about real stuff at the time, and it all unfolded back then, right? So the preterist is a common interpretation of what the book of Revelation is about, that we had a 1st century wandering Christian prophet around Western Asia preaching in all these churches, a narrative story about the faith surviving and thriving under oppressive regime, and everything that was referred to was all about them. The other evolving perspective is called the historicist position, that the symbol sets in the book of Revelation are about world events that are occurring over a long period of time in history. Some of the stuff has happened, and some of it seems unfulfilled. So that's called the historicist position. These are people who believe the BOR really does refer to world history. Then we get the one that we all know about in our time, the futurist perspective, which is the rapture people and the evangelical the kind of drama stuff of it's all about to happen. It's a futurist perspective. It has not happened yet. It's been coming for a long time, and it's about to all come down, right? So that's the futurist perspective that has a big raft of writers in the last half century. Then we have the idealist framework, and this certainly comes. You can certainly kind of fit Swedenborg in here. This is looking at the text as allegory, and it's not saying that anything is up. It's saying it's hard, it's creative to decipher it, but it's a spiritual story. It's about spiritual ideas. It's about spiritual conflict and spiritual salvation. And so it's allegorical about the world of spiritual psychology and one's salvation. And lastly, very popular today is ideological, saying that, listen, this book is doesn't necessarily mean any one thing, but because it's imagery, to read it in its historical context of an oppressed culture, trying to speak to liberative values and vision, are very malleable symbols, and we can sort of read in front of them in all kinds of useful creative ways today. So so you can repurpose them for ideological reasons that support a particular perspective on what are true values. So Swedenborg has some interesting aspects of read. So, and as I say in the essay, these are the 5 paradigms, as I call them in the essay, and then there's a 6th paradigm, and it has a one and only speaker in it, and it's Swedenborg. Swedenborg's paradigm is that it's about real stuff, but none of it is happening directly in the world. It's happening in the spiritual world, and the effects of that, the effects of the spiritual world, are always shaping this world. But the events that are that the Last Judgment and Armageddon and the apocalypse are all about was a spiritual world event, and only the effects are felt down here. So Swedenborg is a 6th paradigm. So he's the only one to make this claim that it's about real events, but entirely in the spiritual world. So he's more definite than the idealist position. He's saying, no, with very specific meanings, correspondential meanings of everything happening in this text. And I probably should get to the part that why it's so wild, that we can see it in the argument I make a little bit about why he didn't publish Explicata. But Swedenborg I've not found another exegete of the BOR who goes verse by verse in a meticulous way. There may exist one. I didn't hire a research assistant to help me find something or anything, but I certainly have searched, and I learned a little bit along the way about BOR interpretation. I haven't found anybody else going, including the old people back in other centuries. They were more general in their commentary, and of course I talk about the New Jerusalem. I'm going to skip over the theology of history. I've already spoken a little bit about that. The unsolved mystery. Why did Swedenborg not publish these volumes? There were the theories that existed were, well, it was just getting too big. And my response is, really, when did that ever stop Swedenborg? Right? It's like he thought it was too big, and it's like there was even one person kind of said that it's just going to be too expensive to publish. Seriously? I don't think so. But people were in the new church were grasping for explanations. Why he never comments on it? He probably never realized. It did not, of course, he dies suddenly. He has a stroke and dies in England, right? And it's probably, it didn't occur to him, even though he could see all kinds of things, that every scrap in his home office would be carted off to the Academy of the Royal Academy of Sciences in Stockholm, and would be combed over meticulously, and that there people would find his ready for the press big stack of that would be 6 volumes of stuff, and that there would be all these people going, what's the story with this? Of course, in Explicata, he doesn't go all the way to the end of 22. He throws his pen down at a very interesting point, and he throws his pen down at 1910, and that's when the rider on the white horse appears. Well, whoa, and we're talking about the ultimate symbolism and correspondence to the second coming. We're talking about the work that he had been called to do. What is the second coming? It's the unveiling of the inner sense of the word. The second coming of the Lord is in the salvific understanding of New Church theology. And so he throws his pen down in 1910, but he doesn't have a diary about what's going on. He already stopped his diary back in 17. He stopped his diary. In his diary, he's talking about seeing things in the spiritual world. This is why I know, I think Jonathan Rose agrees with me, that there's evidence as early as 1755, which is 2 years before the Last Judgment, that he's writing down experiences where he's witnessing events that look a whole lot like what he says happens in the Last Judgment. Of course, he was never saying it started on a particular day. He loosely refers to 1757 as the year. So anyway, there's a lot of information in his diary about everything coming apart in the spiritual world, before he threw his pen down at chapter 19. But he does throw his pen down at chapter 19 verse after explicating verse 10. Another theory is, so that's my theory, is that the majority was written before the Last Judgment occurred. Swedenborg is a little careless about dates. Sometimes he misdates things in the diary. And then one theory is that he needed to really live through it more to understand the significance of it. That kind of makes some sense to me. If you read the diary, that he's having all these experiences, but it's not like he gets a message from the 8th angel and says, write this down because it's coming down now. It's Swedenborg, in my mind. You can see that he is shaping his thought as he continues to have more and more experiences. He takes on new topics and he emphasizes new themes. And so you can see that that in my I guess this slide is really talking about my refined theory, that he had to live through it and think about it a lot. And it took, because on the page, he had the title page ready for the printer, even though he still had some more to do, chapters in particular, the rest of 19, 20, 21, and 22. But he already had it. He already had the title page done, and he had the year on it, 1759. And so he was planning on publishing it in 1759. And so you can see by my dating that he probably threw his pen down around early 1759, and then walked away from it. So the reason why I call it, my last comment here, the reason why I call my essay Revelation Unveiled the axial volume of the New Christianity is because Explicata he never even mentions witnessing the Last Judgment in Explicata. It's primarily about spiritual issues. It's primarily about the universal church, not the new church. The new church with a small n and a small c is not even really dealt with as a significant topic. It's a different kind of reflection on the meaning of the book of Revelation. What happens in the meantime, by the time he gets back to it, is he has become critical of the old church in such a thorough way that he's now in a mindset that a revolution is taking place through the second coming. A revolution of historical Christianity is taking place, and the old church is beyond repair, and there needs to be a new church. And so you see, after he does stop to write Conjugal Love, but then he moves into his big critique of old Christianity. That's the last thing he works with, the old Christian church. So if you read True Christianity, which is structured like a Lutheran systematic, working topically, first chapter on God, second chapter on Jesus Christ, third chapter on the Holy Spirit, fourth chapter like a good Lutheran on Holy Scripture, and so on through all of his topics. And every chapter is lined up this way. Here's what the old church says, and here's what the new church says. So the critique that he comes back to in Revelata is he starts nailing the problems of the old church and why it's broken and cannot serve for the purposes of salvation in an effective way anymore. And as I mentioned in the essay, he starts, the very first thing you read, if you get a copy of Revelata, is a preface where he lays out the major doctrinal positions of the Reformed Church and the Roman Catholic Church. He does that. Why does he put that in there before he even gets to verse 1, chapter 1, verse 1? Well, he's about to take it all down. So that's why it's the axial volume. And that's why the churches call themselves the Church of the New Jerusalem. Hey, 2 minutes for a lot of discussion.
Thanks so much, Jim. That was really, really fantastic. Because we started a little late with my preamble and intro, we can go into beyond the half-hour mark, if that's okay with everyone. And if you have to leave, that's of course understandable. You could do it at your own leisure. But we have a lot of great questions and comments in the chat. So I wonder if we could start there, perhaps. And I'll give for all of us a big round of applause. Thank you, Jim. This is really, really illuminating and very thought-provoking. And I think you're making a major contribution to one of the big puzzling mysteries in Swedenborg scholarship, with trying to puzzle through why this work was abandoned and then returned to, and locating it in the timeline of Swedenborg's life. I'm convinced. I think it's a great answer. I don't know if you want to read through the chat, or I could just lift up as the moderator here.
I'm looking at them.
Yeah.
I could just take them one at a time quickly.
Great.
So Paul Hunter, interpretation history, fascinating. Do we have any sense of how the books of the Bible were influenced politically? Oh boy, that's too big to engage. But yes, there's everybody, all the books of the Bible have enormous amounts of commentary. And there's certainly a broad part of commentary history of scholars who believe that you have to read the world behind the text, and you have to, so that they do historical criticism of how the books were shaped in the context of their times. Doesn't necessarily close down that there's something bigger being used by God there. But yes, there's a lot of scholarship on the development of the canon. And oh yes, well, so Paul Deming says John of Patmos used the imagery of Daniel, and of course Swedenborg has on his title page referencing Daniel. And a big, it's clear that the what is commonly used, and I use it rather than assuming that it's Paul the Evangelist, I mean John the Evangelist, is that John the Christian prophet was Jewish, because by the time you're up there, in the diaspora, the Gentiles are pouring in, and John the Christian prophet has a big concern about too much dislocation from the Jewish antecedents or the Jewish foundations, Hebrew Bible. And so and so even though you don't see him mentioning, John, whoever did the book of Revelation never wrote anything else under that name. So it's not like but in terms of having clear lines of interest in using Hebrew Bible as a foundation and guidestone for the evolving Christian discourse, to not lose that'll be an ongoing argument in the first century, where there's a tremendous argument about pulling away entirely from Hebrew Bible, led by Marcion, and which is a Pauline extremist kind of movement. It was a big argument. The Marcionites lose. They lost the argument partly for reasons that lead to deep explorations of the inner sense of Scripture, because the Hebrew Bible was the one that told us about the Messiah. The Hebrew Bible is the one that knew about the Messiah. And we cannot let go that the Hebrew Bible gave us the Messiah ultimately, and therefore it is not to be ditched. And yes, the Old Testament is very important to the Christian prophet John. Good question, Paul. And then I'm going to move on to carrying file. The arguments why? Well, the problem with saying that the disciple John is the author, there are advocates for that. Most of them are located in traditional evangelical movements who have usually been not friendly to historical criticism of the Bible. The problem is geography. The problem is the calendar. It would be really, really late in the evangelist's life to have been that person, that there's no other history of memories, memoirs, and stories that the evangelist traipsed up and down Western Asia in those particular cities and towns, and that the language of Greek is not similar to what the fourth gospel uses. So it's kind of literary analysis as well as biographical analysis, and so nobody knows, right? But I find it convincing that that the writer of the book of Revelation is not the author of either the Johannine epistles or the fourth gospel. But hey, it's a cottage industry, and people make their living off of arguing about this stuff.
Well, the people in Ephesus seem to believe it's the same, if you've ever been there, because the legend in Ephesus is that he accompanied Mary to Ephesus after he was out of exile. He left Patmos, and they take you up there and show you Mary's house up on the hill where they believed she lived out. And then you go over to Messina, and they celebrate the letters that Mary sent to their early Christian community. So when you go actually into the region, they do think it was the disciple John.
Yeah, I think the dating is still a problem. I'll tell you what, I'll send you some stuff. We can talk about it some more. So it's definitely the kind of thing that you could do a whole conference around, authorship of the BOR. And there's no way to prove anything. So you're sort of giving some evidence that would create a story that it's not necessarily far-fetched. And another thing that you have going for you is that in early church tradition, the evangelist did write it. But the problem with that argument is by the time you get into the 2nd and 3rd centuries and later, they actually had a million things wrong. So it was very hard to keep accurate information going in those days because nobody had email and nobody had. So, but another argument made in favor of it is that the early church believed that the evangelists wrote it. But one other question would be, why does it matter, right? That it was clearly an inspired Christian follower named John, and who knows?
Well, I guess the only reason it would matter is that he'd be among those who actually had known Jesus. So that's why people might feel that it matters. He wasn't like Paul. If it's the actual John the disciple, he experienced all that early missionary work that they were all engaged in. So I think that's the thing. But I agree with you. Who knows if people in Turkey
How are you relating Mary to the book of Revelation?
that the idea that they have in Ephesus is that when John eventually left Patmos, his exile was over, and he accompanied Mary to Ephesus, where she was in a house up on a hill, which you can still go visit.
Oh,
Okay?
no,
In fact,
I
you
get,
can
and I can also,
water from her spring.
I
you know-
can also take you to the Holy Land and show you where Jesus bought some gum. I mean, there's all kinds of stories about who went where, and a lot of stuff, narratives were created to tell stories that made sense to people. So I understand that there's that tale there, but a lot of historians would mark it as not credible.
No, I mean, it might be 13th century stuff, but still.
It's all fun.
Peter has his hand up.
Peter.
Jim, after all this work on the book of Revelation, what is one of your major takeaways? What did you learn in this process about what maybe stuck with you about the meaning of the book of Revelation?
Well, what I do like theologically, I mean, there's a way in which, even if Swedenborg is bashing Catholics in a way that makes me uncomfortable, he's such a healthy theologian. And the theology that he writes when he comes back to it, he didn't get past 1910 the first time. When he comes back to it, the theology of the design of the holy city itself is I think, beautiful theology. It gets into the power of lived ideals. It gets into the psychological dynamics of why truth will never be your friend unless you are inspired by love. And he just has a tremendous way of constantly presenting the ethical, healthy, spiritual way to live into community with others that is always infused within the family of God. And so I think there's I think you can preach healthy sermons for a really long time out of the BOR, out of Swedenborg's Revelata.
That's beautiful. Maybe that's the right note to end on. Truth will never be your friend unless you are inspired by love. That's a wonderful distillation of a positive message. And we sort of began the conversation with my intro with a lot of bleakness of sort of the apocalyptic dimensions of political discourse, climate change. So I like ending on the holy city and love that holds truth. So Jim, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and sharing so generously. We congratulate you collectively, and we're delighted. We're excited. We have to do a book party when the New Century edition finally comes out.
Yeah.
With
Hopefully,
Revelation
I haven't seen what the editor's going to do with it.
unveiled.
But thank you. It's great to be here. It's great to see a lot of friends and a couple of new faces. And A terrific gathering here. Yeah.
Thanks, Jim. Great
Thanks,
to see
Ellen.
all of you. We'll reconvene, of course, in 2 weeks for aliens, life on Mars. And to my students who are here, we'll meet in the other Zoom for the class, which I've resent as an email during our session. So let's take a bio break for my students. We'll take a breather and come back, and 5-7 minutes we'll get onto that Zoom space. Be well, everybody. Stay healthy and see you next time.